William Crown with us. Dr. Crown is the Chief Scientific Officer for Optum Labs, and in that role has responsibility for both the external and internal research activities of the labs. Dr. Crown came to Optum from Thomson Reuters, where he served as Vice President for Outcomes Research and Econometrics there. He was there for more than 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Before that, he had a distinguished academic career at Brandeis, where he was on the faculty of the Florence Heller Graduate School and taught graduate courses in statistics and conducted research on the economics of aging and long-term care policy. He received his doctorate in urban and regional studies from MIT and has a master's in economics from Boston University. Dr. Crown is highly published and a frequent speaker on statistical and economic methods at conferences. I had the pleasure of sitting on a panel with Bill at last year's ISPOR conference, the International Society of Pharmacoeconomic and Outcomes Research, which that organization he served as president of for that year. That was maybe your swan song.
Yes, the swan song. Now I'm a has-been already. So.
Great, so please join me in welcoming Bill. We're looking forward to hearing about Optum Labs.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Leslie. It's a great pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do is talk with you about a new entity that is making available research environment and data for academics and for other healthcare stakeholders. And this is Optum, as you may know, is a very large company. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of United Health Group. United Health Group is a Fortune 17 corporation. 2/3 of United Health Group is United Health Care, and a whole series of benefit design and insurance products under United Health Care. And then Optum is about a $44 billion entity itself. And it does everything from government consulting, life sciences consulting, all kinds of software for managing data and electronic medical record systems, and a whole variety of different things. And those businesses create data flows that in its relationships with those entities, Optum sometimes acquires the rights to use de-identified versions of that data for research. And so the data assets that I'll be talking about today are largely coming from those various Optum businesses where the entities that Optum is doing business with upstream have agreed to allow a de-identified version of their data to be used for healthcare research. One of the entities that Optum has a lot of relationships with is the Mayo Clinic. And these are everything from network management to software support and consulting support and a whole variety of things. And going back a couple of years, the fall of 2012, senior management at United and the Mayo Clinic took a look at these data assets, which had been used for government and life sciences consulting up to that point, and said, these data are really underleveraged. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered, open questions about real-world effectiveness and how care is organized and disease management. Some of those questions are drug questions, but a lot of them are not drug-specific questions. How do we sort of create an environment where we can bring people together that come from various viewpoints within the healthcare environment to tackle big problems in healthcare and give them the resources to do that? So thinking about that, there's also the issue that the research that tends to get published tends to come from sort of bivariate or sometimes trivariate relationships. So consulting firms working for the federal government, or consulting firms working for pharma, or academics, with government funding doing research and so forth. And so that has the potential to skew the way you frame the question. Not that anybody is intentionally trying to distort, the findings so much as just where you come from, sets up how you view what the problem is. So one thought was, if we actually create an environment where payers and government agencies and academics and provider groups and life sciences companies actually could all come together to tackle big problems in healthcare, the way they would tackle those, the way they would frame the questions would be different, because in essence, they'd have to take account of the other viewpoints and how they were setting up the problem formulation. And so we felt like that was really missing in healthcare. There wasn't a place where that was happening. So that was one thing we were trying to do. The other point I already mentioned is that Optum has substantial data assets, very large de-identified claims data. I'll talk more about specifically what these are. Very, very large electronic medical record data. And the ability to sort of provide access to large commercially insured populations, in particular, is something that academics have not had a lot of access to, nor provider organizations. Providers tend to have access to their own data, but not broad data sets. And academics tend to do a lot of work with Medicare data, but don't often have access to commercially insured data. And life sciences companies, on the other hand, have had access to commercially insured populations. So how do we sort of create that ability to be able to have access to those data? And particularly the ability to actually have access to linked data. Can you actually link the electronic medical record data together with the claims? And I'll talk a little bit later about what some of the advantages of that linkage are, because each of those types of data has strengths and weaknesses. And so the top two boxes are really about research, and then the bottom two are more about innovation and development of prototypes and development of tools. One of the things that we want to do, and I'll talk about this as we go, is accelerate the translation of clinical evidence from the generation of the evidence into clinical practice, because there's this like 17-year lag that people quote all the time about from the time something is discovered to the time it actually becomes standard practice, standard of care. So what sort of mechanisms can we create that actually take those results and immediately put them into practice? And the whole kind of model of Optum Labs is working with clinical organizations like Mayo Clinic to actually prioritize the research that goes on, so that the projects that are focusing on clinical translation, and this clinical, I shouldn't say clinical translation, translation in general, because this could be policy translation as well. But take those results and then immediately put them into practice and create like a learning healthcare system to feed back into the research design. So we have these 5 major assets. There's the data, which is about 150 million lives of claims data. This is largely United Healthcare de-identified claims information. It's 150 million lives over 20 years. So cross-sectionally, in the most recent periods, it's about 35 million lives of data. 40 million of electronic health record data. And then there's 38 million lives of AARP data. And AARP data is interesting because it's broader than healthcare. It's all about the consumer. So these are consumers 50 and over. But it allows you to be able to think about how people are making decisions around health insurance, for example, in the context of other kinds of things that they're interested in, like leisure activities and so forth. So that's the kind of the core data asset. I mentioned already that we want to focus on the convening of these different people together. and the translation. And then Optum is a very, very large organization with a lot of clinical capacity and epidemiologists and health economics folks and so forth that we can draw upon in the labs. But our model is not actually to be like a big mega research institute from an Optum standpoint. What we are is an infrastructure play. So we're creating this, this data environment that I'll talk about in more detail. And we just have analysts that work with our partners to help them get access to the data and understand the data and so forth. And then I happen to have some whole series of methodological interests around data linkage and bias reduction and so forth that the Optum Labs itself is working on. But our staff is small, and we intend to keep it small, because the idea is to create the research, bring in the research partners and have them do the research, have them propose the research ideas. So we don't want to get in the way. We don't want to be a bottleneck. We want to be a facilitator of the research. And then we have some very, very fast tools that sit on top of the data that allow you with little drop-down menus to be able to set up inclusion, exclusion criteria, comparison groups, vary time windows, and so forth. And within maybe 2 or 3 minutes, you can do sort of the inclusion, exclusion criteria for feasibility for a study. And that will hit 100 million lives of data, and it will come back in about 12 seconds with a series of heat maps. And we're using that on every single study that we do, because it's just so, it saves about 3 weeks worth of work to go out and assemble all the codes and write the programming and do the ETL, and then to format the results and so forth. So it's very, very good for sort of feasibility and accelerating the research process. So here's just a little bit of detail about the data. The claims data is the typical sorts of claims. So information that's in claims. So if you go up to these fields on the top, medical claims, pharmacy, that is very typical in claims data. We have laboratory test results for about 1/3 of the people that we observe lab claims for. And that's because United gets these feeds from its central lab vendor. But we miss labs from hospitals and cancer clinics and things like that. But there's also some very interesting data that isn't typically in claims around sociodemographics. And this has come in as a result of UHG's interest in understanding disparities in care by race and ethnicity. And that, we couldn't observe it in the data. So years ago, 2006, I think it was, Optum, as a business associate at United, did a linkage with sociodemographic data from a market research company. And this particular study was for diabetes patients. And we brought that data back in, and we stratified the data by the claims healthcare utilization patterns for these diabetic patients by race and ethnicity and education level and income and so forth. And there were all these variations in patterns of care that were totally invisible before. It was just kind of variation within the claims lives. And so that became part of the regular data feeds for United. And that's part of the data on an ongoing basis. And then we also link to Social Security mortality data, which has of late not been as reliable because there were some issues around financial fraud with Social Security reporting. And Social Security leaves it up to the states as to whether or not they report the mortality data or not. So we're now only getting feeds for about 23 states. But nevertheless, we have some mortality data. So that's the claims information. And another nice piece of it is that when somebody enrolls in United Healthcare insurance, they're assigned a unique ID, patient ID. So that allows, if they if an employer decides not to drop United Healthcare as an insurer, and a whole bunch of people drop out of the data set, and then they subsequently decide to offer United again, and those people come back in, you'll see a gap in their care, and you'll know that they're not in the data, and then they'll come back, and you can hook those people back together again. And claims data, as you know, is a challenge, especially commercially claims data, because there tends to be about a 25 or 30% turnover in the commercial population, and people move from plan to plan, and you just can't tell that they're the same person, so you double count typically with claims data. So Optum Labs was announced on January 15th of 2013 in a Wall Street Journal article. And 2 days later, Optum acquired a company called Heatmaps. Heatmaps is a company that goes into big provider groups and hooks up their EMR systems and puts it into a common data format and provides back a bunch of analytics to the physicians so that they can see their patients across these treatment settings and have a more complete view of the patients. And in response for doing that, Heatmaps asks those providers to be able to use a de-identified version of the medical record data for research purposes. So what we're bringing into Optum Labs is not the charts themselves, but we're pulling over structured data. Heatmaps has done a lot of work with natural language processing to pull content out of notes, because they found that about 70 or 80% of the content was still sitting in the notes, even though the structured fields were there in the EMRs. And so they have vital statistics type data that they pull out, blood pressures and things like that they get for everybody. And then they've been building disease-specific content for things like congestive heart failure and depression and cardiovascular disease and diabetes and so forth. And they now have 12 different disease states where they have the specific variables that they've constructed for individual diseases, and those are pulled over. And it's about something like 60,000 different data elements that we're linking. So we've been working with, we have a lot of history working with the claims data, no history at all in working with the EMR data. It's linked, and we're just starting to work with it. So what I would say is that as we sort of begin to work with data, and particularly the linked data, this is an opportunity to kind of really, I think, advance a lot of fundamental challenges in observational data analysis. I think the linkage of the data is going to help a lot in terms of understanding what the limitations of the various data sorts has been. And then this ARP data we have pulled over, and we're going through the process of the de-identification certification. What fields can we take from ARP that can be combined with what other fields and still have a de-identified data set? And we use there's 5 or 6 of these certified statisticians that certify databases as being statistically de-identified, and we are working with one of those. So that's in process. We haven't worked with that data yet. So here's just a comment on the limitations. There's a lot of challenges around and concerns around the reliability of inferences that one draws from observational data analyses, and particularly in terms of the dissonance sometimes of the results from clinical trials, randomized trials, to what you get with observational data sets on similar cohorts. I happen to think that a lot of that has come from not having complete covariate control. So with claims data in particular, you just don't have deep clinical information. So you don't have, if you're looking, and you often don't have the outcomes that you're interested in. So if you're interested in cardiovascular disease or diabetes or cancer, or you don't have cancer stage, and those omitted variables are undoubtedly very, very important and will create bias without your ability to control for them. What claims data do have is a very comprehensive view of the patient. So you see, you have a pretty good reading on all the comorbidities of the patient and the concomitant drugs that they're on, treatment across treatment settings, and so forth. The medical record data is very strong clinically, but it's very narrow. So it tends to be specific to particular sites, and you don't have as strong a control for comorbidities. So each one of those data sets, and it's by itself, if you use either one of them, you'll probably end up with biased results. If you put them together, you may get a lot closer to what you would get if you were doing a randomized controlled trial. So this is an open sort of empirical question, I think, to be able to do a whole bunch of studies with linked data. And even part of our research now is actually doing work on subsets of the data and showing how different the results are from the linked data. Which essentially is an estimate of how much bias is there, in just doing analyses with claims alone. But there's also the opportunity to be able to compare, to these linked data, results of these linked data with randomized controlled trials for very similar patient populations, and see, well, how close are we actually going to get to measuring the same average treatment effects in similarly defined patient populations? It's an interesting empirical question, I think. So I think I've talked about most of this chart already. These are the typical claims information, the lab test results, and the socioeconomics and the clinical. We also have a couple million lives of health risk assessment data. We expect that to grow over time. I haven't actually worked with that very much. We have had some experience in working with health risk assessment data from employers. That's a real challenge because each employer has a different HRA assessment. So the ability to kind of find a lowest common denominator that allows you to pool the data has been a bit of a challenge, but there is some information there. And then we have some special data sets, provider information from the AHA, some benefit plan design data, and we don't hook that data up with the broad data set except on a project-specific basis. So we have I'll talk a little bit more about our research environment, but we basically have a virtual sandbox where we put the data in that sandbox that you need for your question. And then, so if your question requires information about providers, hospital providers, we'd use the AHA data. If you were doing something on high deductible plans, the benefit plan design data would be in there. But if you're interested in something like small area variation in care and you don't care about plan design, then that data wouldn't be linked up. This shows you kind of the waterfall of the cohorts that we can follow. So United has the same sorts of turnover as most health plans does, but because you start with such a large patient population to begin with, you have a group of about 4.5 million patients that you can follow for at least 7 years, 7 years or more. And about 1.4 million of Medicare Advantage patients that you can follow. Medicare Advantage patients they look like the commercial population in the sense of their data content. You have the prescription drug information and the claims data and enrollment information. So that's interesting. And then the Heatmaps data has more stickiness to it, and this is interesting for a couple different reasons. One is because the Heatmaps data is coming from providers, it's all payer. So, it's about 40% Medicare, and then there's about a 15% overlap with United, which reflects United's market penetration. So about 15% of the Heatmaps lives are linkable back to the claims data. But you don't see, there isn't as much turnover in the Humatica data as there is on the claims side. And it's also interesting when you compare diabetes and osteoporosis that the osteoporosis population falls off less. And I can't assert this and know this for a fact, but I believe the reason that you see less fall off in the osteoporosis group is that's probably a Medicare population. And so you're not having the insurance effect, with the provider. You're just having the provider change effect with the osteoporosis population. Whereas with diabetes, people are both changing provider and changing insurer. And so if a new insurer doesn't cover that network, that provider isn't in their network, then you could lose the patient. So the idea is to continue to expand the data, so opportunities to potentially be able to link to tumor registry data, for example, or registries of all types. We'd love to have other commercial payers in here. We'd love to have Medicare data. So we're talking with virtually everybody in the healthcare system around, bringing data in and the value of continuing to expand the data asset. One thing I'll just say is that the method for the data linkage that we're using is generalizable to allowing other data linkage to take place. So all of the data that's in Optum Labs is de-identified before it ever gets into Optum Labs. So if you think about where the data comes from, Humatica, as a business associate of these provider organizations that it's putting the EMR data into, has access to the protected health information of patients. So it knows names and addresses and social security numbers and so forth. And similarly, Optum, as a business associate of United Healthcare, has that information. And AARP has similar information, although not quite the same as healthcare providers, on the people that are AARP members. So how can you kind of link that data together in a HIPAA compliant way, because it sits in different places? The clinical data is with the providers, and the claims data is with the payer organizations, and the consumer data is with the consumer organization. And the way that we're doing it is we're using salting and hashing methods. So the idea is you send each of these data holders who have a right to this information on the patients a common salt, which is just like a common number, and then a one-way hashing algorithm, which takes each one of those elements and it hashes it, encrypts it. But it's a one-way encryption, so it can't be reversed engineered. And each element is hashed, and then you hook the patients together with exactly the same hashed information. So Humatica never has to send us names and addresses and social security numbers. They're encrypting all the data at the source, and then we're linking the encrypted IDs together, and then we're hashing them again so that even the hashes are rehashed. That's an approach that allows you potentially to link to any data source where the data holder has PHI without having that without that source having to actually send PHI. So we're hopeful that this is a strategy that is going to allow us to continue, particularly with the Humatica data, which is all payer, to be able to continually link that data to more and more payer or information from the payer sources, whether they're government payers or commercial payers, and expand the linked data set that we have. So this is just the tool that I mentioned, natural history disease, that is the analytics. So this particular example is a cardiovascular one. And so we've got these 4.5 million patients that have the condition of interest. It finds an exact set of twin populations that have exactly the same hospital referral region and gender and data service. And it hooks those up. So this is not a propensity score matching algorithm, and it's not intended to support statistical analysis in and of itself, but it just creates a comparison group on the fly. So the overlapping group that we have is 68,000 that have the characteristics that we're interested in studying. And then it just gives us a whole series of heat maps. It gives us, takes their total healthcare expenditures for both the treatment group and the comparison group, and takes that total expenditure and just distributes it across all the different ICD-9 categories. And so if the comparison group is, if the characteristics of the expenditures were being driven by the characteristics of the comparison group, the boxes would be blue. And if they're being driven by the treatment group, the boxes are red. And you can click on each one of these and, and just drill into more detail on the underlying diagnoses. You can do the same sorts of things for procedures and for laboratory test results. But the main thing that we use this for is really for the inclusion-exclusion criteria to estimate sample size, because it just makes it so much faster to just be able to do feasibility studies than to write standard code for it. So the idea is some of the partners are interested in research, some of them are interested in innovation, some of them are interested in translation. There's a potential. The business model of Optum Labs is to operate on a cost recovery basis. So we obviously have a big sunk cost because we have a beautiful facility. I'd love to have you come up and visit. But our original idea was that before we had built the data environment, warehouses, that people would actually come to Optum Labs and be in residence. So professors would come there on sabbatical and so forth. So the space, one half of the space are these huge, really beautiful collaboration spaces, and it looks out over the Charles River and Beacon Hill and Leonard's Acre Bridge and Citgo Sign and Fenway Park, and it's really, really the best view in Boston. It's wonderful. But it turned out that you don't have to be there. You can just log on to the server virtually. So we end up using all this space. We hold meetings and things like that, and people come in, and we use it all the time. But it wasn't the sort of the original intent. But we've got this environment, and then we built this data environment. We have an infrastructure of Optum Labs is maybe 55 people. Half of those are kind of our IT folks that are building and supporting the data warehouse and all the subsidiary support stuff that goes around that. And then the other half are researchers that are supporting the partners. And then the partner organizations come in, and then they actually do the research. And then there are because our model is to make the data available as low cost as possible, that idea is just that it's just going to cover our costs. So whatever it costs us to set up the virtual environment for you, I'll give you some more detail on this in just a second, but you can build that into your R01 or your PCORI grant or whatever, and then you come back, and when we set that up, it's just covering our costs providing that service. So it doesn't dig us out of the hole. So the opportunity to actually recover the sunk costs comes from life sciences companies kind of supporting us, and for opportunities around innovation where companies that need access to healthcare to develop their tools, whether it's a new care pathway or whether it's a quality measure or whether it's some sort of a new electronic system that links up with an EMR. We have an opportunity to take an equity stake in a company like that, and depending on how involved we are, that can provide a revenue stream back for for Optum Labs. So that's just part of the business model. With the life sciences companies, we have a very large commercial consulting business, and so any of the research that we do with life sciences companies has to be focused on our Optum Labs mission of improving patient care and the value of care. So it has to be a question of the sort of a rising tide lifts all the boats sort of question. And a drug comparison to sort of support marketing claims of my drug versus somebody else's, those are fine questions, but those are questions for commercial entities and not for Optum Labs. And I think the one that's a little bit different than that is potentially safety questions, where academic institutions that are asking safety questions, those are sort of in the ballpark. So here's the current list of partners, and you'll see that these big ones on the top, Optum and Mayo and ARP, were all kind of founding partners. ARP is a founding partner in the consumer area. But then AMGA, American Medical Group Association, I think about a third of all the physicians in the US are members of AMGA. So these are big provider organizations, and all of the Humedica data, as electronic medical record data, is coming from AMGA membership. So that there's a tie-in there. Boston Scientific is leading a constellation in heart failure. I'll mention constellations in just a moment. Merck and Pfizer. And then the early academic partners were BU, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is a alma mater of Paul Bleischer, who is our CEO. But they're interested in some very interesting things around. They were some of the developers of the semantic web. So there's some very interesting things there that are tied to graph analytics and new ways of bringing in data with a light touch that are of interest to us. Harvard Medical School. Our relationship is with Harvard Medical School, but particularly with Barbara O'Neill's group, Department of Healthcare Policy. Medica Research Institute, not the payer, Tufts Medical Center, Lehigh Valley Health Network, it's University School of Nursing, and University of Maryland, which is doing some very interesting things in the area of Alzheimer's. And then there's another whole set of partners that are just about to come in before the end of the year, probably about 10 more, and I hope one of those is Duke. So we've been talking with Duke for quite a long time now. We're really close, and the idea would be that with Duke in as a partner, then the researchers within Duke would be then eligible to propose research projects within Optum Labs in the manner that I've been talking about. So just to give you a flavor of the research, where it's not any surprise, we're focused on behavioral and policy research, kind of understanding the behaviors of what are the drivers of physician and consumer behaviors, for example. But our thinking about this is maybe a little bit different than the usual, because we're thinking a lot about some of the challenges. Now, this kind of gets to the root of this behavioral, analysis with behavioral data issue, where when you think about what's in these electronic medical record data sets and claims data, we often tend to operate like it's consumer data. So certainly we treat a lot of the drug, medication, refill behavior kinds of things. We've developed a whole series of benefit designs that are, intended to influence patients. But, maybe with the exception of drugs, almost everything else that's in the data is being driven by providers. Think about diagnosis codes and procedure codes and, services. Services may be jointly, dates of service may be jointly determined. But that means that from a statistical standpoint, those estimates are totally confounded. If you're trying to estimate, the impact of a physician on outcomes or patient on outcomes, you've got to be able to tease those things apart. And so Economists have been thinking about this for 100 years, since agricultural supply and demand days. It's the challenge is partly a data challenge, bringing in enough data to be able to identify the consumer and provider behaviors, and it's partly a statistical challenge. So we worry about that a lot. I think we can advance the field in terms of raising awareness about this and appropriate methods for working with these types of data. Variation in care, except for the IOM study last year, very little known about variation in care in the commercially insured population. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Heterogeneity treatment response, and then methods work is, in addition to the kind of stuff I was just talking about, lots of interest in, alternative statistical methods for linking data together, application of multiple imputation methods, for example, the retrospective data sets to fill out the data that you can't link. What are the estimates like when you operate on the superset of linked data versus the subset of, the data where you have the exact linkage and so forth. A lot of methods work. This is just to give you a sense of some of the kinds of things that are underway. Mayo, as the first partner, was, of course, really active right out of the gate. So I remember probably in March, maybe sooner, maybe it was February, we sat down with Mayo to come up with a set of initial projects and came up with something like 100 topics that they were interested in. And the way they work is that their physicians, their practicing physicians, propose the research, and, based upon questions that they have as a result of their clinical practice. And then Mayo has a very structured process for doing research where if the physician stops coming to the research meetings, they just cancel the projects because they say, if they're not, actually motivated enough to come to the research meetings, how likely is it that they're going to take the results and put them into clinical practice? So there's a very sort of heavy translation emphasis that we're really interested in. And now I think there's about 28 active projects with Mayo, and very few of them are drug related. This is a whole range of different kinds of things. There's about 60 others that are in the pipeline to start up. And what we've noticed recently is that as a result of these new partners that have joined that I flashed up on the screen, now the influx of new proposals is already equal to Mayo's. So, although it was dominated by Mayo in the early going while these other partners were coming in, now it's about equal, and it's going to be that the new partners are just going to be doing the lion's share of the research when they get scaled up. You think about somebody like Duke coming in and the number of research projects that could be going on with Duke, it would be probably similar to Mayo, I imagine. So here's our process. We didn't want people, particularly we were worried initially that life sciences companies in particular might be trying to kind of find a way for access to these data for commercial purposes. So we wanted to be able to have a process that would sift those projects out and say, that's a fine question, but you can work with our commercial group on that. And we also wanted to be able to evaluate questions for feasibility, because we expected that a lot of clinicians, for example, might ask questions that were fine questions but can't be answered with the data that we have. So we didn't want people to spend a lot of time writing a proposal, out of the gate for something that wasn't doable. So we have a one-page template where you basically say, what's the idea? We have a research group that has the representatives from, originally it was Mayo and Optum Labs researchers that were reviewing these, but now it includes members from each of the partners. And they review the one-page template, and then as long as it's it's within the mission of Optum Labs and it's actually something that can be answered with the data, we say, send us a regular protocol. So people write up a proposal, And they're not like writing an R1, but it's 10 or 12 pages typically, where it's the question, what are the endpoints, what are the methods, what are the inclusion exclusion criteria, all that sort of stuff. Who's going to be working on this? What's the publication plan? Do you have funding or not? And by the way, we're trying to create mechanisms to actually fund research that doesn't require external funding. And this is one of the things that we're interested in with our life sciences partners, where we're asking them, I'll give you an example. Boston Scientific is an example. They're funding a constellation in heart failure, which is it's a research program in heart failure. And initially they're funding 3 projects, and they get to pick what the projects are. And then anybody else in Optum Labs can participate in those projects as co-investigators. And then they also set aside a grant, a $50,000 grant that for academics to be able to come in and do something in heart failure. And so other constellations that are kind of on the horizon right now are Alzheimer's disease, which is very active and is growing rapidly. Management of multiple complex comorbidities is another one. Quality measurement is another one. And those are I would say those are the 4 most active. And then other ones are opioid addiction and sleep disorders. And then there's a whole set of things around methods that are also, I think, potential topics. But then, upon approval of the detailed research application, once you have funding for the project, we set up the data file and put that data file in the virtual sandbox. And at that point, you can log into the sandbox and you can start conducting the research. And so these are what the fees are. So the only thing that you actually have to pay for as a university is the exploratory sandbox. So it's $5,000 per year. Normally what the universities do is, all the entities do is they develop a power user, who's the person that goes in and learns about data, and other people kind of work through them. The actual data itself is a one-time fee of $35,000. So if you had like a R01 that was 3 years in duration, you'd pay the $35,000 once. It's not $35,000 per year. And then the typical fees are $15,000 additional, which are the support structure. So 2 access portals of $5,000 each into the sandbox. You can have 2 people working simultaneously in the sandbox. And then $5,000, which is basically like 20 hours of consulting for the analyst to answer your questions. And what we're doing, our analyst bandwidth is not totally consumed. So we don't really care whether you use 20 hours or 40 hours or 50 hours. We're not going to charge you over the 20 hours until we can't, we don't have the analyst time anymore. And then that's it. And then we have a special incentive of you can buy additional logins for $2,000 a year. And then we're really trying to encourage this collaboration. So if we have academics working with a government agency, working with life sciences or provider groups, so you get a 3-way collaboration going, then we only charge you $10,000 for the data. So, it goes from $35,000 down to $10,000 as an incentive for the collaboration. So I think that's basically Optum Labs. And I think I'll stop just to give you guys a few minutes. But I want to also just, this is, by the way, is what the space looks like. Well, hang on a second. I think I'm going the wrong way. when the photographer took the picture, he neglected to notice that there was a trash can in there. But so there, yeah. But that's what the space looks like. So please feel free to just drop me a line, send me questions also if we run out of time, and I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards and also respond to email questions. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Bill. Great presentation. I want to make sure I actually get to have lunch with Bill, so I'll save my questions for later if there are others, because I know we don't have much time.
It's very impressive, and we look forward to tapping into Optum Labs. So, and also I think what you show is very reasonable in terms of encouraging collaboration. As part of that, one of the things I wanted to see what's possible in terms of even pushing the envelope. So notable on one of your slides was blank spots for patient-reported outcomes. And we certainly think that's a very important part of value of care. We have a lot of programs evaluating health status. Are there opportunities where that's something that we could bring to the table here to connect within the Optum Labs?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think one of the huge challenges is that patient-reported outcomes are, with some rare exceptions, not in these retrospective data sets. So sometimes you have PHQ-9s and things like that, but they're generally not there. And until they get into the clinical flow, they're not going to be there. So I think there are opportunities potentially to link to patients where data has been collected in research studies or registries or, PCORI, for example, using this kind of salting and hashing methodology that I mentioned, where if those patients overlap, with the patients in our data, we potentially put that data together. One other thing I'll just mention is that I'm just about to send in a paper where we had linked data and then we broke it apart, and then we basically linked it back together again using machine learning, where we didn't actually link the same people. And what was interesting about that was the example of what would be the case if I didn't actually have the ability to link the people, but I could only link them statistically. What we found is that it actually, you could see that the sampling distribution moved back towards the truth that you had when you had the linked data together. And so there's no reason to expect why that wouldn't be the case with PRO data also. So, there are big data sets of PRO information like healthcare, health-related quality of life data sets and things like that, where you could essentially use things like multiple imputation to link PRO data into this retrospective data as another mechanism where you couldn't actually do the PHI linkage. Yes?
So very much, John Alexander, very much enjoyed your talk. I run clinical trials for a living, and so I'm thinking about all the potential uses of this data. So it's de-identified to individual patients, but it's not de-identified to institutions, to hospitals, right? And regions, and so...
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, so, I think there are a lot of opportunities around understanding the distribution of healthcare and patients, and that might be relevant to clinical trials. And then along the lines of what Adrian was bringing up, using your salt and hash process, which I don't really understand, but have you thought about linking this to clinical trial data sets? I mean, we have hundreds of clinical trial data sets with all the outcome data, monitored, et cetera, and in theory, the same processes are possible to link the data with data you have. You could do a lot of QA on the data quality and various data collection methods, et cetera.
Yeah. No, I think the linkage to data for patients that have been randomized just opens up a huge number of potentially valuable and interesting research possibilities. There's one of the things that's very hard to do in an observational setting is actually collect all the detail around all the clinical interventions and the claims and the timing of events and so forth. So if you can focus on getting the clinical detail that you need, in that study, as well as things like patient-reported outcomes, where you have to get it from the patient, and then you can hook to the administrative systems where all this other detail on all their care is provided, which people are very bad about being able to remember anyway. Then I think that's extremely promising.
Great. Well, thank you again, Bill, for a great hour. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, everybody.